Okay, Diane, so we have a question from Joanne. How is post-secondary going to fit into these laws, and how will it be funded?
Post-secondary is definitely part of the law. How it's going to be funded is going to be under negotiation between the First Nation governments and the funding agencies. So when you put lifelong learning as one of your guiding principles that's non-negotiable, then you put everything in there from maternal infant care to early learning and child development from 0 to 6 years. You put your K to 12 and post-secondary. So you look at the whole gamut of learning, and in addition to post-secondary, you think about skills-based training as well, and trades training, and specialized training that may come not necessarily from a college or a university, but it may come from a corporation. And you make the entire gamut of training right through to adult training and retraining as part of your education law. And then, of course, how it's going to be funded is always, that's the negotiation piece. So I'm going to move on now to the First Nation Lawmaking Protocol. And I want to thank you, Joanne, for your questions. They're all really good. So the strengths of our people are always from the land. The land defines who we are, the sounds of our languages, the kind of clothing that we wear, our cultures, our celebrations, our dancing, and so on, our songs. All of it is defined by that land where we come from. That's what makes us so rich as First Nations. And so when we start to look at what are our strengths, of course, our homelands. And our homelands define, by our resources, it defines our way of governance. So the way of governance of Haudenosaunee, because we're settled agrarian communities, is very different from Mushkegowuk communities and how they govern themselves. So it's very unique in that way. And so that's why the education law and the protocol for making law will be different in many different areas. So what gives us our strength? Our strength comes from our spiritual connection, and it comes from our cultures and how we express those cultures on a daily basis. Those cultures have formed into great civilizations for our people based on our own traditional knowledge systems. And our languages also make us incredibly unique. They contain core values of attitudes, behaviors, and they define who we are as nations of people. So our laws of life come from, first of all, sacred law, what we have been told in our divine law teachings, in our Medei Women's Scrolls, in our Great Law of Peace, in our codes, our prophecies, our medicine lodges. And that has formed spiritual law. It forms about how we are to be in relationship with each other and with the natural world and with the spirit world. And so that natural law is the law of how we behave as human beings within the order of creation here on Mother Earth. And that then forms into family law. How does your family express all of those laws in its daily function? So we talked about spiritual law before, where it comes from those original stories of creation, the original instructions we were given as a people on how to behave. And of course the land formations also reflect that. And our societies, our medicine societies and lodges that contain cycles of ceremonies and our prophecies talk to us about the right way of being human within creation. And we say that education is a pillar of sovereignty. There are many pillars of sovereignty, but education is one of the primary ones because freedom is much prized by our people, and sovereignty is something that we hold on to as a gift from the Creator. Jurisdiction means that we act now to make that sovereignty come alive. We take responsibility. We make our laws. And we protect our homelands. We protect our people when we make our laws. So the spirit and the intent of those early alliances and the treaties are reflected in our homelands, but also in our laws. And you saw this slide before where we draw our authority for nation building. Our primary authorities as First Nations come from our sacred laws, from our inherent rights, our Indigenous rights, and our treaty rights that were enshrined by our ancestors making covenants with settler nations. International laws have confirmed that we are sovereign peoples, self-governing, self-determining, and have the right to make our own laws. And many court decisions in Canada always fall in our favor. Some do not, but the ones that fall in our favor, we need to also develop those decisions into practice, into daily practice. So if we don't do it, government sure isn't going to do it. Government is not willing to change their policies and ways of doing things, even though they lost the court decision. Very hard to get government to shift. But when we start to implement those results of court decisions in our own laws as First Nation governments, then we're a force to be reckoned with. Government, of course, will always draw its authority from man-made laws. So the current climate that we live in, especially under a conservative government, is one of continued control and power and racism. There's a lot of racism in this country. So when you're living in an environment of control, governments and external forces dictate standards for you to live by. They are basically pushing for assimilation, continued poverty and dependency. And there is a definite power differential between governments and First Nations. And the belief in the superiority of the Government of Canada is something that the government of the day holds on to. And the socially engineered power differential is so entrenched in this country. It's been made to fit the laws of Canada so that Canada remains in control. So there's that power differential that we are aware of and deal with. There's also racism. Yep.
Sorry. Joanne just wanted to know if you could explain what a treaty right is when it comes to education.
Well, I think because I read the Sheila Carr Stewart's document on treaty rights in education, and she really focuses on treaties 1 to 7. When I think about a treaty right in education, I think about the ceremony that was held that day between our people and government representatives, and the intent with which our people went to that negotiation. They went with their bundles, they went with their pipes, they went with their elders and spiritual leaders, as well as speakers and chiefs, and they went with the full intent. And that's what I always go back to. If I had to describe a treaty right in education, I would describe the intent with which our leadership made those agreements. And so what was that intent? That intent was to say, we're going to share land, we're going to share resources, and in exchange for that, we want to make sure that our people live a bountiful and abundant life in our homelands, that we continue to have our freedom, we continue to be self-governing, we continue to maintain our languages, our cultures, and our way of life. We're not extinguishing our rights, we're not giving up our lands, we're sharing them. Sharing is a very different concept than extinguishment or giving up land. And when we talk about what does education mean in that context, I believe what our elders and leaders said at that time was that We want our people to understand this new way of life that's coming towards us and these new people that are coming. That there's good things that they have to teach us, but that doesn't mean that we're going to change who we are. We're going to look at their stuff as tools to help us embrace the changing world that is upon us. And I believe our ancestors and leaders at that time, visionaries and prophets of that time, really knew what was coming at us. And they knew that we needed the schools, the teachers, the ways of doing things that would help us to have tools to move in that world, but not changing who we are. So that's what I think a treaty right to education is. I think it's the intent of our leaders on that day when they brought those issues forward. Because they also talked about health and well-being at that time. I love that question because it's so deep. And when you get together with treaty people, and especially the oral keepers of the treaty relation, and I was really privileged in my life to spend time with Helen Gladue, who was an oral treaty keeper and was trained 6 women with the knowledge that she carried, and they continue to advise their chiefs every time their chiefs meet the Government of Canada or the provincial government on issues of rights and funding. Those women are present, and the chiefs often defer to those women for the information that they need. How was it on that treaty-making day? What did we understand on that day so that we could bring that forward? So I think that oral tradition of keeping the knowledge system around that treaty-making alive and transmitting it from generation to generation is a key point.
You got a follow-up comment, Diane?
Yeah.
If that's the case, why did they allow the residential school to happen?
When that time period, and I'll go to Haudenosaunee because I know them the best, my known people, in the 1840s. So picture how our people lived in the 1840s, because that's when the mush hole, the Mohawk Institute, was put up in our community. And it stood there till the 1970s. The fact that we have any culture or language left today is a testament to the strength of spirit of our spiritual leaders. And so why did they allow that to happen? We have to go back to the time when the community was run by the Indian agent and the RCMP, who had full control and full authority over everything that happened in the community. Where you're going to sell your produce, where you're going to sell the meat that comes from your farms, where you're going to sell your grain. They had full authority over everything. And so, when the people were manipulated and controlled, and it's hard for us in this time period to say, why wasn't there a revolution? Why didn't we do this? Why didn't we do that? But you know what? We have to go back to that time period and really understand the mindset of that time. Because that mindset of that time, the Government of Canada has inherited that. Because, when we look at that section on slide 8 where it says racism, we're talking about the Government of Canada's impression that we have an inferior capacity to manage funds. And that's what they always say. We want you to be accountable, transparent, with funding and all this. Nobody makes reports like First Nations do. It's up on our websites. Hundreds of reports, go in every year from every First Nation, because if you didn't, the contribution arrangements would not continue to flow. So are we being accountable? Absolutely. Are we being transparent? You have to. You have to. There's no other way around it. But the impression that the government would give to Canadians is that their money is being mismanaged. And it's true that in some First Nations there are some financial difficulties, but that doesn't mean third-party management and shut them down. It means that they need help to get back on their feet. So what we're dealing with is systemic dependency through legislation. So every time the Government of Canada puts through a new suite of legislation, whether it's water, matrimonial real property law, land ownership in First Nations, what they're doing is they're legislating on behalf of our people. So unless we have our own laws in place, they're going to continue to do that. So that's the current climate that we live in. So if you have a nation mind of sovereignty, you have a deep belief in the sacred laws, in the languages and traditional life of our people. You love that life and that freedom. You believe that we live in a country of abundance. You're not afraid of scarcity. Our people have come through really hard times. We know what scarcity is, and we believe that we live in a place of abundance, and that when you live in concert with natural law, you're always going to be blessed by that abundance. And we also know that our laws help us to live in balance with each other and the natural world and creation. We believe, as peoples, as nations, in self-determination, that we are self-governing, that we are sovereign, that we have our homelands, and that those ancestors that walked before us have blessed these homelands. And so what action do we take? Having all of these beliefs, what action do we take? We have to put it into action now for nation building. We have to develop our own laws and our own systems. So I developed this declaration for the exercise of sovereignty. And what I say in that declaration is that First Nations have never relinquished sovereignty to their rights and to their homelands. That we have a continuing right of self-determination and self-government. The right to self-government is the same as the right to make laws. And that jurisdiction over education is the right to make decisions and to have a structure for making those decisions. We have that right as a people. Now the question is, and it falls back to our responsibility, how are we going to exercise that? What does it look like? So if we were going to develop our own education law or a constitution, what we would say, as an example, is that we would say sovereignty, jurisdiction, territory, cultural worldview, our languages, our history, the context for the exercise of jurisdiction over education. Its authorized programs, services, and facilities includes legislative, executive, and administrative functions. So our overarching belief, whether it's in the Constitution or whether it's in our education law, has to talk about our sovereignty and jurisdiction, the territory that we occupy, the responsibility that we take for our citizens both on and off the territory, and the cultural worldview and languages, because that then gives us the jurisdiction over programs, services, and facilities, and it includes the right to make laws, the legislative function, the executive function, which is the role of chief and council, the role of the education authority, the role of the director of education, and then all the administrative functions that go along with running a school system that a First Nation education authority would offer. So the lawmaking protocol has to capture all of that. So how does it do it? It makes an open and accountable procedure for all the rights holders of the nation to become involved. And the law that is going to be developed from this protocol reflects the culture, the language, the customs, and the aspirations of the First Nation. The lawmaking process is in keeping with nation law principles and justice. It's a standardized procedure for the design, the enactment of law, the appeals under law, the amendments under law, and the repeal of any kind of law is all embedded in that lawmaking protocol. The First Nation lawmaking protocol is an instrument. It's a tool to enable the First Nation government to enact its education law and to make any amendments. So drafting the law, procedures for passing laws, making amendments, appeals, or repealing the law in its entirety. There's also conflict of interest rules embedded in there, and how to make regulations. That's an important piece, because those regulations make the law come alive. They bring it into operation and show you how to make amendments when things shift and change in the community and your community environment changes. There's always an evolutionary process going on in our communities, so the law-making protocol allows for amendments as well. So drafting the law, I mentioned earlier in the first PowerPoint that the First Nation government will assign a technical working group. And that technical working group should be the same people sitting on that board for the entire process of making the law, any appeals, amendments, or repealing the law. That group should be the group that's going to see it through its whole process. And the First Nation government, Chief and Council, should really set the timetable, because you don't want it to go on for years. You want a timetable where the first draft is brought back, where Chief and Council sees it, they authorize community meetings, there's a summary that's developed, a discussion guide that's developed, and then focus groups happen and so on. But there's always a feedback, all those feedback mechanisms. And then the decision about, is it going to be passed by resolution, or is it of the First Nation government, or is it going to be passed by a community referendum? So the way that you get started is that the First Nation government, Chief and Council, introduces a resolution with the intention to develop an education law. Then the technical working group forms and it drafts the preliminary version of the law. There's community meetings to present the law, discussion guides, the summary, public meetings, but there's also, very importantly, a legal review. And that legal review is done by your lawyers, who then have a real good look at it and say, is this a functioning document? Does it have all the elements it needs to have? What's missing? What needs to be added? So you can vote again by resolution or referendum. And sometimes there's not a clear support for the law. The law has to go back into another discussion process of small focus group sessions. So, the community reaction to that law and the First Nation government decision to put it back into more discussion is also possible. So, and it becomes law on the day of its passing. Here's a sample resolution that the government can use, the First Nation government can use. Can everybody see that?
A couple of comments or questions there, Diane.
Okay.
First question is, and who does the resolution go to? And then the second part, resolutions and referendum are ANDAC concepts, are they not?
Well, you can use your own way of voting or showing agreement. If you have a traditional way of showing agreement, then you can use that. You don't have to use voting or a referendum. It's up to the First Nation government and its citizens to decide what does agreement mean to us, and then put that into place. Define what it is and put it into place as your way. And the sample resolution is for the First Nation government, the Chief and Council. Okay, so we'll move on to the next one. It's making regulations. So the First Nation School Authority has the power and the responsibility to make regulations according to the education law. And all those regulations are just like mini laws. And they have to align with the principles of the law. They can't be different from what the law says. They have to support what the law says in education. And if the community has a constitution, the overarching constitution, I'll give you an example of what that is. So in the Dakota Sisseton Wahpeton Tribal Education Code, the tribe has a constitution. And it says in the constitution, these are our 4 main pillars for what we want our citizens to know. We want them to know their traditions, so songs, ceremonies, history, rites, and so on. We want them to understand how they relate to external governments, the government of the United States. We want them to know skills that will enable them to move both within the nation and outside the nation. We're hoping that they're going to come back and work for us inside the nation, but we want to give them skills that they are portable and can move anywhere. And we want them to know about their economy, their tribal economy, their tribal jurisdictions, which is based on their history, their environmental knowledge. We want them to know that as tribal citizens. So if your constitution says that, then when you make your education law has to follow those pillars that were set in the Constitution. So that's what this part of making regulations means, that when you have an education law that says, here's the purpose of education, it's going to make a strong Anishinaabe citizen who is fluent in the language, knows their songs and ceremonies, rites, and history as one pillar. The second pillar is that they have an education of excellence, that by our own tribal standards or nation standards, we meet or exceed those of the province. We meet or exceed those. We want them to understand that whatever they choose to do in the world, that they can move anywhere in the world to work. So your regulations then look at the purpose of education, and they bring that into another level to say, how are we going to make that happen in the school system? So that's what regulations are all about. And then sometimes there's going to be appeals. People don't like what's in the education law for whatever reason. It's not working for them. It's affecting their family maybe in a negative way. So any rights holder can challenge the law by filing a written petition or making an oral deposition to the First Nation government. And if you're supported in that deposition, you can get other people to sign on with you, and then the First Nation government has 30 days to respond to you. It can set out reasons, the First Nation government can set out reasons to reject the appeal, or it can amend the education law, or it can say, hey, this law is obviously not working for our community, we have to repeal the law, or we have to change the regulations. So there's a whole lot of things that can happen as a result of people challenging the law. It can only get stronger and better as it evolves with the community. And if there's like a fight between families and the First Nation government and the Education Authority, and it doesn't seem to be resolving, then an arbitrator can come in and hear the appeal if the decision by the First Nation government is not acceptable to the rights holder. And that decision of the arbitrator is final. So that's in the appeals section. So conflict of interest rules. Most places now have their own versions of conflict of interest rules, and it comes up as a policy of your government. So you can have a look at that and see how that looks, and if you want to work that into your education law, you can do that. And it talks about any member of the First Nation government or the school authority who has an interest financial or otherwise, in matters of education, has to disclose this fully and remove himself or herself from discussions on the subject and not influence decision making. So that's just an example of what a conflict of interest rule might look like. So if you were going to vote on an education law by the First Nation government, here's an example of a process that you could use. And this is slide 20 now. The special meeting will be called by the First Nation government 45 days ahead, could be 60 days, 90 days, whatever you want, but it notifies the membership, the rights holders, that the education law is ready for a vote by the First Nation government. So notices go out to newspapers, radio, cable TV, mail delivery, notices posted in public buildings, and of course on the website, and calling people to the meeting. When the meeting occurs, there's a summary of the law that's read aloud at the meeting. And I just said a percentage of First Nation government members must be present for the vote, and it's a vote by secret ballot. So I said I would like to see 3/4 of the First Nation government members approving the law for it to function in the community. And that was just the number that I chose, because I thought it was, by choosing 75%, it reflects a clear majority. I don't like the 50% plus one rule. It can be manipulated too easily. So I said 75%, but you can make it whatever percentage you want to make it. Like in every ballot that is a government-based ballot, the First Nation government should have an electoral officer, somebody overseeing the voting procedures. And the law can only be enacted if 75% of the chief and council give their approval. And then they make a resolution that confirms their decision and the results of the voting. So that's one process that you could follow to see if that works in your community. If it doesn't work in your community, design your own process. Some communities, and this is really true of some of the larger ones, that they want to make sure that there's a referendum that all community members are allowed to, or given the opportunity to express their opinions. So the First Nation government will set a referendum date 45 days after the secret ballot vote. The notice can be given as in due process, the ways that we talked about earlier, the website, the radio, the local newspaper, postings in public buildings in the community. The First Nation government will specify by resolution the threshold number of members required to vote in order to pass the law. So depending on your population and your membership code, whether you allow people off the reserve to vote or not, the First Nation government has to determine what's the number that we need in order to pass this law. So they'll figure that out. And the education law is enacted if the threshold number of votes approving the law is cast by referendum and has said yes to the law. So you can change that. You can change the number of days. You can really think about what is a threshold number. You can think about the style of voting that you want. It doesn't have to be, the regular style of voting of a ballot box, sign the X here, yes or no. There's many different styles of voting that are more culturally in line with the way that our people want to express opinion. So you can make that whatever you want. The law can also be rejected. If you're part of the rights holders you reject the education law, or the law is rejected at a special meeting of the First Nation government, or it's rejected in a second referendum. There can be no development work done on that law for 180 days after it's been rejected, because there has to be this cooling off process. There has to be a time when people step back and reflect, what was wrong with that law? What was it that was not culturally congruent with the way that we see things evolving for our people? What is it of the process that we follow that is not culturally congruent? So it's a time of reflection, and that doesn't mean that you'll never have an education law. It only means that we're stepping back from it to reflect, and then we'll take another run at it when we're ready. So this piece is important because this is the enactment process. And the enactment process means the First Nation government can approve or reject the education law by resolution within 30 days. That all members of the First Nation government can sign that resolution, and that the education law comes into effect on the day of its passing by vote or by referendum, and then you post a public notice. Just to let people know, was it approved or was it rejected? You can make amendments to the law, and you can actually repeal the entire law if you don't like it. You can take it right off the books and start fresh. So this is where your technical working group comes in. They can then start to work on a new law, or they can work on the amendments that will make the law stronger. And of course, there's always legal advisors that are present who can look at the final drafts and make their comments as well. And then what happens after everybody has another look at the amendment, then it's going to go into public meetings and focus group sessions. And usually that's a 90-day period, depending on how big your community is. But it gives people, enough time to have family meetings, home meetings, school meetings, community education council meetings, so that people are really feeling comfortable with the way that things are moving. And then a resolution will confirm the final decision, and the results are published by whatever way the First Nation feels comfortable, whether it's published and posted in public buildings, there's handouts delivered in the mail to community members, it's on the website, or it's in the local newspaper. So you can even amend this protocol. So this is a protocol for lawmaking in education. You don't like how the protocol is set up and you want to add to it or omit certain sections, you can develop your own protocol, because this protocol is just a suggestion, a series of ideas that you can use to start to think more deeply as rights holders about how to make a law in your community. How is it gonna look? What's the process that we need to follow? So you decide on the form and the content of your protocol. The First Nation government lets members know the steps. We're going to amend the protocol now, and notifies members of a vote by the First Nation government. They're gonna vote on changing the protocol, and we say at least 75% of the First Nation government, chief and council, has to be present and vote to adopt the amendment to the protocol. And again, the belief in our people that we can do this. I remember sitting in an Anishinaabe education meeting last week, and one of the elders raised this issue and said, we have to believe in ourselves that we can do these laws, set up these protocols, do this work on curriculum and education standards, because just because we haven't done it doesn't mean that we can't do it, but we have to believe in ourselves that we can do an excellent job for our children. So here's the place for more information. So Roxanne Manitowabi, and the phone number for the office, and it's ONECA@ONECA.com. So I'll open it up if there's any comments or questions. John?
Thanks for that, Diane. I'm not seeing anything at
Okay.
Not seeing anything right now.
Well, I want to thank everyone for being online with us, for going through the information, and refer you again to the resources that are available for you. There's lots of resources that are on the ONECA website, and in particular those 3 that I referred to in the first go-around, which was the Educational Law Template, the 90-page paper, the Lawmaking Protocol, it's about 25 pages long, and then the Highlights paper, which goes through all the milestones that we've achieved in the last couple hundred years. So those are important pieces, and if they help you at all in the work, I really encourage you to have a look at them. And I want to thank you for being online with us today. It's been a real privilege to be with you. Thank you.